The Iliad is one of the oldest and most powerful tales ever told, a poem that has carried the voices of warriors, kings, and gods across the ages. It is a story of pride and anger, of love and loss, and of the fragile line between glory and ruin. Tonight we step into this world of bronze and fire, where the fate of nations rested on the strength of heroes and the will of the gods. As you listen, let your mind drift to the shores of ancient Troy, where the greatest of Greek warriors gathered, and where the wrath of Achilles would change the course of legend forever. Settle in, close your eyes, and let the story of the Iliad gently unfold. Before the clash of armies and the thunder of war, the world of the Iliad must be understood as a landscape shaped by myth, memory, and legend. We begin in the Aegean Bronze Age, a time when kingdoms flourished on both sides of the Aegean Sea. The Greeks, known for their proud city-states, were not united under a single banner but bound together by common gods, a shared language, and above all, a code of honor that guided the lives of warriors and kings. Across the sea stood the city of Troy, rich and fortified, positioned on the shores of Asia Minor. Its walls were said to be so tall and strong that few believed they could ever be broken. This was no ordinary city, but one destined to be remembered forever in song and story. Life in this age revolved around ideals that were larger than life. To a Greek warrior, the pursuit of honor was as essential as food or water. A man's reputation was his immortality, for once the body turned to dust, only his deeds could live on. The battlefield became the stage where honor could be won, and glory, known as Kleos, became the greatest prize. Glory was not only for oneself, but also for one's lineage, ensuring that fathers, sons, and grandsons would be remembered with pride. For the Greeks, to live without honor was worse than death itself. The gods watched closely over this world, not distant or silent, but deeply involved in human affairs. Zeus, king of the gods, presided over Olympus, holding the scales of fate. Athena favored cunning and courage, guiding warriors with her wisdom. Hera, queen of the heavens, burned with pride and jealousy, her favor and anger shaping destinies. Apollo, the god of light and prophecy, could send plagues upon armies or grant victory with the pull of his bow. Aphrodite, goddess of love, brought passion and desire but also strife. To the people of this world, the gods were not abstractions. They walked among mortals, took sides in battles, and swayed the outcome of human lives. No warrior fought alone, for behind each stood the hand of a divine patron or enemy. It was within this vibrant, divine, and mortal interplay that the stage was set for the Trojan War. Troy, with its high towers and bustling trade, was envied by many. Its wealth came from its strategic position along trade routes connecting the Aegean and the East. The Greeks saw Troy not only as a city of strength, but also as a gatekeeper to riches and influence. Yet the war that would rage for 10 years was not started by trade disputes or politics. Instead, it began with a story of love and pride that carried within it the seeds of destruction. At the heart of the spark was Paris, a prince of Troy, handsome and youthful. He was destined to play a role that would alter the fate of nations. According to legend, he was asked to judge a contest between the goddesses Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Each promised him a reward if chosen as the fairest. Hera offered power and dominion. Athena offered wisdom and victory in battle. But Aphrodite offered the most tempting prize of all, the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose Aphrodite, and with that decision, the course of history was set. The The woman promised was Helen of Sparta, wife of King Menelaus. She was said to be the daughter of Zeus himself, her beauty unmatched in all the known world. When Paris journeyed to Sparta and won her heart, whether by seduction or abduction, she left with him for Troy. This act was more than a theft of love. It was a deep insult to Menelaus and a wound to his honor. For a Greek king, such an outrage could not go unanswered. The call went out across Greece. Kings and warriors who had once been Helen's suitors were bound by an oath they had sworn to defend her marriage and punish anyone who would wrong it. One by one, the greatest heroes of Greece assembled: Agamemnon, brother of Menelaus and king of Mycenae; Odysseus, known for his cunning; Ajax, a giant of strength, and many more. But above them all stood Achilles, destined to be remembered as the greatest warrior of his age. Thus the Greeks prepared their fleet. 1,000 ships bound for Troy. What began with a single choice made by a Trojan prince would ignite a war of gods and men, a struggle for honor, love, and glory that would echo for centuries. The Iliad does not start with the launch of these ships, but with the 10th year of the war. Still, to understand the wrath of Achilles and the fall of Hector, one must first know this stage, where gods watched closely, kings stood proud, and the fate of Troy was already sealed. The spark of the Trojan War was not a clash of armies or a quarrel over land. It was a matter of the heart, yet one that struck at the very foundation of honor and loyalty among kings. When Paris, prince of Troy, carried Helen away from Sparta, the outrage spread across Greece like fire. To Menelaus, king of Sparta, the insult was unbearable. Helen was not only his wife, but her beauty had been entrusted to him by oath and by right. To have her taken by another man, whether by persuasion or by force, was to strip him of dignity before all rulers of Greece. Yet this insult did not rest upon Menelaus alone. Many years earlier, when Helen had come of age, her beauty had drawn countless suitors from across the Greek world. Kings and princes, noble and proud, each desired her hand in marriage. The choice could have easily torn the land apart in rivalry, but Helen's stepfather, King Tyndareus of Sparta, was wise. He feared that whichever suitor was chosen, the others might rise in jealousy and bring war upon his household. To avoid this fate, he made all the suitors swear an oath. They would respect the final choice of husband, and if ever Helen was taken from that husband, they would all unite to defend him and punish the offender. It was a solemn vow, sworn before the gods, binding each man to protect the sanctity of Helen's marriage. When Paris took Helen to Troy, that ancient oath was called upon. Menelaus, humiliated and enraged, turned to his brother Agamemnon, the powerful king of Mycenae. Agamemnon was ambitious, commanding vast wealth and influence, and he saw in this crisis both duty and opportunity. To avenge his brother was an act of loyalty, but to lead the expedition would also raise his own glory. As messengers traveled across Greece, one by one the old suitors of Helen answered the call. Odysseus left his home of Ithaca, though unwilling at first, for he had tried to avoid the war by feigning madness. Ajax of Salamis came, mighty in strength. Nestor of Pylos, aged yet wise, joined with counsel and authority. The greatest of all was Achilles, son of Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis, whose fate was already entwined with a mortal song. Thus, the gathering became more than a rescue mission. It was a coalition of the finest warriors and leaders Greece had ever known, bound by oath and bound by pride. Agamemnon was chosen as commander of this vast host. not only because of his power, but also because he represented the unity of Greece. The war was declared not simply to restore Helen, but to uphold the honor of all who had sworn the ancient vow. The preparations were immense. Ships were built and fitted, provisions gathered, and armies assembled. Poets would later speak of 1,000 ships sailing across the Aegean, their prows cutting through the waves like a forest of spears pointed toward Troy. It was a sight meant to awe, a vision of unity rarely seen among the often fractured Greek kingdoms. With sacrifices made to the gods for safe passage, and prayers offered to Athena and Hera, the fleet finally set sail. Thus began the long voyage that would end in war at the walls of Troy. What had started as the choice of a single prince and the beauty of a single woman would lead to the gathering of heroes, the wrath of nations, and the weaving of destiny itself. The world of mortals and the will of the gods were now moving toward a single point, a war that would be remembered for all time. The Iliad begins not with the first clash of Greeks and Trojans, nor with the voyage of 1,000 ships across the Aegean. It begins instead with a voice, a poet calling upon the divine to guide his song. Homer, the ancient bard, opens with an invocation to the muse. He asks the goddess of memory and inspiration to sing through him, to carry the tale of wrath and sorrow into the ears of men. This tradition was sacred to the Greeks. Every great poem was not seen as the creation of man alone, but as a gift of the divine. For memory and song were considered eternal powers. And what does Homer ask the muse to sing? Not of the whole war, not of its beginning or its end, but of one consuming theme, the wrath of Achilles. This anger, fierce and unrelenting, would shape the fate of heroes and decide the course of battles. Through it, the Iliad reveals the cost of pride and the heavy weight of human passion. From the first lines, the listener is told that this wrath will bring sorrow upon the Greeks, death upon their champions, and despair even to their greatest warrior. The poem is not a tale of conquest alone. It is a meditation on the destructive power of rage. The story begins in the 10th year of the war. For nearly a decade, the Greeks and Trojans had fought without a final victory. The walls of Troy still stood strong, and the Greeks remained encamped by their ships along the shore. Weariness, grief, and longing for home weighed heavily upon the men. Yet it was not Trojan spears that first threatened to break the Greek army. It was conflict within their own camp, a quarrel between their high king, Agamemnon, and their strongest warrior, Achilles. The quarrel arose from an insult to Apollo, the god of light and healing. Agamemnon had taken as a prize a maiden named Chryses, daughter of a priest of Apollo. When her father came to ransom her, bringing gifts and prayers, Agamemnon scorned him and refused. Angered by this disrespect, Apollo struck the Greek army with a plague. Day after day, his arrows of disease fell upon the men, and the camp filled with sickness and death. The Greeks, desperate to end their suffering, gathered in council and demanded that Agamemnon return the girl to appease the god. Agamemnon gave way, but his pride was wounded. To him, the loss of a prize was a mark of dishonor, an insult to his authority as leader. In his anger, he turned upon Achilles. To show his power, Agamemnon seized another maiden, Briseis, who had been awarded to Achilles as a token of honor. In that moment, Achilles felt his pride torn apart. He was the greatest fighter in the Greek host, yet his dignity had been stripped away. Achilles withdrew from battle, refusing to fight under Agamemnon's command. In bitterness and fury, he even prayed to his mother, the sea goddess, asking her to plead with Zeus to grant victory to the Trojans, so that the Greeks might suffer without him. This act of wrath and withdrawal forms the heart of the Iliad, the fate of armies. The lives of friends and enemies alike would be shaped by the anger of one man who felt dishonored. Thus the stage is set. The Greeks, weakened by division, face their enemies at the gates of Troy. The Trojans, led by noble Hector, prepare to press their advantage. And above them all, the gods of Olympus watch and intervene, each favoring their chosen side. The Iliad begins not with triumph, but with discord. For within the greatest of warriors there burns a wrath that threatens to consume all. In the Greek camp before the walls of Troy, the seeds of ruin were sown not by the Trojans, but by a quarrel among the leaders themselves. The Greeks had captured Chryses, a maiden of great beauty, who was given to Agamemnon as a prize of honor. She was the daughter of Chryses, a devoted priest of Apollo. With reverence and gifts, Chryses came before Agamemnon, offering ransom for his child and begging for her release. He prayed for mercy and honored the king with words of respect, but Agamemnon's pride was inflamed. Instead of granting the request, he mocked the priest and sent him away with threats and harsh words. Chryses departed in grief, but not in silence. He lifted his hands to Apollo, the god he had served faithfully for many years, and prayed for justice. Apollo heard the plea and descended from Olympus, carrying his silver bow. He loosed his arrows upon the Greek army, not arrows of war, but of plague. Day after day, sickness spread through the camp. Fires burned constantly as the dead were carried to their pyre. The soldiers, once eager for battle, now grew fearful, for the hand of the god was upon them. The leaders of the Greeks gathered in council, desperate to find relief from the suffering. Calchas, a seer and prophet, spoke with courage. He revealed that the plague would not end until Chryses was returned to her father without ransom and with offerings to appease Apollo. The words angered Agamemnon, who felt his authority challenged, yet the truth could not be denied. Reluctantly, the king agreed to release the girl, but his heart boiled with resentment. Before the assembled warriors, Agamemnon declared that if he was forced to give up his prize, he would take another in its place. His words were heavy with pride, for he saw honor as measured by possessions and the respect of others. This threat fell upon the ears of Achilles, the greatest warrior in the Greek host. He rose in anger, speaking fiercely against the insult. To Achilles, Agamemnon's behavior dishonored not only himself, but all who fought under his command. The exchange grew bitter. Agamemnon, unwilling to be defied, turned his fury upon Achilles. To make his authority clear, he sent heralds to take from Achilles the maiden Brises, whom he cherished. This was not only a wound to the heart, but a public humiliation, for in that world the loss of such a prize meant the loss of honor. Achilles stood powerless against the order, yet the insult pierced him more deeply than any spear. In grief and wrath, Achilles withdrew from the fighting. He returned to his tent and refused to lead his men into battle. His voice, once the pride of the Greek army, fell silent upon the field. Consumed with anger, he lifted his prayer to his mother Thetis, the sea goddess, begging her to intercede. With Zeus, he asked that the Trojans be given strength, so that the Greeks might suffer for the insult cast upon him. Thus, the quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles opened a wound in the heart of the Greek army. Pride, jealousy, and anger had set in motion the tragic course of the Iliad. From this conflict would spring sorrow for friend and foe alike, for the wrath of Achilles was not easily quenched. The war before the walls of Troy was not only a struggle between mortals. High above on Olympus, the gods themselves watched closely, their passions entangled with the fate of men. To the Greeks, the gods were not distant or silent. They were living powers, each with their own desires, jealousies, and affections. Just as kings quarreled over honor and warriors fought for glory, the immortals also chose sides, their rivalries shaping the course of the war. Hera, queen of the gods, looked upon Troy with disdain. Paris, prince of the city, had once judged her in a contest of beauty and had not given her the prize. Her pride was wounded, and she carried that insult with burning memory. She longed to see Troy humbled, its towers broken and its people defeated. Alongside her stood Athena, goddess of wisdom and battle. Athena, too, had been denied by Paris in that fateful judgment. Her favor fell upon the Greeks, and she guided their warriors with strategy and strength. With them stood Poseidon, god of the sea, who often quarreled with Troy for reasons older than the war itself. These three powers together lent their might to the Greek cause, determined that Troy would not stand triumphant. Yet Troy was not without divine allies. Aphrodite, radiant goddess of love, had been the one chosen by Paris in that ancient contest. She had promised him the heart of the most beautiful woman, and she remained loyal to him and to his city. She shielded him from danger and strengthened the Trojans with her favor. Apollo, archer, god of light, also loved Troy. He answered the prayers of its people and fought fiercely against the Greeks when they insulted his priest. His silver bow sent plague into their camp, and his presence on the battlefield inspired courage in Trojan hearts. Ares, the god of war, favored Troy as well. Unlike Athena, who valued wisdom in battle, Ares reveled in chaos and bloodshed. Wherever the fighting grew fiercest, he delighted in joining the clash, and his strength often turned the tide toward the Trojans. At the center of all stood Zeus, father of gods and men. He sought to keep balance, for it was his will that destiny should unfold as it was meant. Yet even he leaned gently toward Troy. The pleas of Thetis, mother of Achilles, reached his ears. She asked him to grant the Trojans strength so that the Greeks would feel the absence of her son. Zeus listened, and though he remained the great judge of fate, his hand often tilted the scales in favor of the Trojans. The division among the gods mirrored the division among mortals. Pride, jealousy, and longing guided both heaven and earth. When Greeks and Trojans met in battle, unseen hands were always at work, guiding arrows, strengthening arms, or turning fear into courage. The Iliad shows that the war of men could never be separated from the will of the gods. Olympus itself was a battlefield of passions, and the rivalries of immortals shaped the destiny of Troy as surely as the spears of warriors. Asterisk. The 10th year of the Trojan War opened with skirmishes and duels that set the tone for the long struggle ahead. The plain before the walls of Troy became a stage where warriors tested their strength and honor, each hoping to gain glory beneath the watchful eyes of their comrades and the gods. Dust rose from the ground as armies faced one another, the clatter of shields and the gleam of bronze filling the air with both dread and excitement. Among the first to step forward was Paris, Prince of Troy. Proud of his beauty and skill, he longed to prove himself in open combat. He challenged the Greeks to send forth a champion, and Menelaus, husband of Helen, rose at once. For Menelaus, this was more than battle. It was a chance to reclaim his honor and to punish the man who had taken his wife. The two armed themselves and met between the lines. The duel began with spears and shields. and both fought fiercely, yet fate seemed to favor men. He struck Paris down and would have ended his life with a final blow. At that moment, Aphrodite intervened, the goddess of love, ever protective of Paris, swept him away from the field in a cloud of mist and carried him back within the safety of Troy. The Greeks cried out in anger, for victory had been stolen from them by divine hands. The war, it was clear, would not be decided by men alone. Following the duel, fighting surged again across the plain. Heroes from both sides clashed in moments of brilliance and brutality. At times, the Greeks pushed the Trojans back toward their walls, pressing them with the strength of Ajax and the cunning of Odysseus. At other times, the Trojans surged forward, led by Hector, the son of Priam, whose courage and sense of duty inspired his people. The tide of war moved like the sea, rising and falling with no final result. The gods too were not idle. Apollo gave strength to the Trojans, filling their hearts with courage. Athena guided the Greeks, steadying their hands and turning blows aside. Each side felt the presence of their divine protectors, and each knew that victory was never far, but always uncertain. As the days of fighting stretched on, the Trojans gained momentum. Under Hector's leadership, their attacks grew fiercer. The Greeks, weakened by the absence of Achilles, found themselves driven back again and again. The Trojans pressed so hard that the Greeks were forced to retreat behind the walls they had built around their ships. Fires burned in the distance, the cries of warriors echoed, and for the first time the Greeks feared that the tide of battle might sweep them into the sea. The first great battles of the Iliad revealed the fragile balance of the war. Honor was won and lost in moments, but no single duel or clash of spears could bring the conflict to an end. The plain of Troy became a place where glory shone brightly, then faded, as the struggle of mortals and gods intertwined. Both sides knew that the true trials still lay ahead. In the story of the Iliad, one figure shines as the noblest of the Trojan defenders. Hector, eldest son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba, stood as the guardian of his city and its people. He was not only a prince, but also the commander of Troy's armies, a warrior whose courage and sense of duty made him beloved by his soldiers and family alike. In a war filled with pride and wrath, Hector embodied a different kind of heroism, one grounded in loyalty, responsibility, and love. To understand Hector, one must first see him beside his brother Paris. Where Paris was reckless and guided by passion, Hector was steady and thoughtful. Paris had brought Helen to Troy, and in doing so, he had set the spark that ignited the war. Yet when danger came, Paris often shrank from battle, relying on the aid of Aphrodite or the protection of others. Hector, in contrast, never turned away. He carried the weight of his city upon his shoulders, knowing that the lives of his people rested on his courage. Where Paris sought personal pleasure, Hector sought only to defend his home. Hector's devotion extended beyond the battlefield. Within the walls of Troy, he was a husband and father, bound with tenderness to his wife Andromache and their young son Astyanax. In one of the most moving scenes of the Iliad, Hector meets them upon the ramparts before returning to fight. Andromache begs him not to go, for she fears that without him Troy will fall, and that she and their child will be left alone in sorrow. Her words reveal not only her love for Hector, but also her understanding of his role as the city's protector. Hector, though filled with affection for his wife and son, cannot turn away from his duty. He speaks gently to her, acknowledging the pain of what may come, but declaring that he must stand in defense of Troy, for to do otherwise would be a betrayal. Of all he holds dear, this moment captures the essence of Hector's character. He is torn between the longing to stay with his family and the obligation to fight for his people. Unlike Achilles, whose actions are driven by personal pride, Hector fights for something greater than himself. His honor is not only his own, but also the honor of his city, his family, and the generations yet to come. On the battlefield, Hector's presence inspired courage among the Trojans. He was the one they looked to when hope faltered, the shield that stood between them and destruction. His skill with spear and sword was matched only by his unwavering resolve. Yet even in his strength, there was a deep humanity. He knew the dangers he faced, and he foresaw the ruin that might one day come upon Troy. Still, he chose to stand and fight, for his love of his people outweighed his fear of fate. In Hector, the Iliad gives us a vision of a hero who is more than a warrior. He is the heart of Troy, a man whose courage, honor, and love for his family made him the true defender of his people. His story reminds us that even amid the clash of armies and the will of the gods, the noblest strength is often born of duty and devotion. As the war raged into its 10th year, the absence of Achilles left the Greek army weakened. His wrath kept him away from the battlefield, and without his strength the balance of power shifted. The Trojans, emboldened by his absence, pressed forward with renewed courage. Led by Hector, their forces drove the Greeks back step by step, filling the plain with the cries of battle and the clash of bronze. Agamemnon, though proud and determined, was struck by a wound that forced him to withdraw. His strength as a warrior was broken for the moment, and the Greek host lost its commander. Into this void stepped others who sought to hold the line. Among them was Ajax, towering in stature, whose great shield stood like a wall before the advancing Trojans. His courage shone in the heat of combat, for he met Hector again and again, each duel shaking the field with the sound of their blows. Odysseus too proved his worth, not only in strength but in cunning. Known for his sharp mind, he devised ways to rally the men and keep order where chaos threatened to break their spirits. In one clash, surrounded by enemies, Odysseus fought with fierce determination, though wounded in the struggle. His bravery reminded the Greeks that the war was not lost, even when the tide turned against them. Still, the Trojans pressed harder. With Hector at their head, their confidence grew with each victory. The Greeks, fearing that their ships would be destroyed and their path of retreat cut off, began to build defenses. Walls of earth and timber rose quickly around the vessels drawn up on the shore. Trenches were dug and gates were fortified, for the sea was their only escape. Without ships, they would be trapped before the walls of Troy, and the war would end not in victory but in ruin. For a time the defenses held, and the Greeks fought desperately to protect them. Yet Hector was relentless. Driven by duty to his city and strengthened by the favor of the gods, he pressed the assault with unyielding force. He rallied his men with words of encouragement, urging them to strike while the enemy faltered. Trojans surged forward, hurling stones and fire, battering at the gates and climbing over the walls. The struggle reached its height when Hector broke through. With his spear flashing in the sunlight, he led the charge into the Greek camp. The walls that had seemed strong now gave way under the weight of his determination. Flames leaped skyward as he set fire to one of the Greek ships, a sight that filled the Greeks with terror. The fire threatened to spread from vessel to vessel, consuming the very lifeline of their army. In that moment the Greeks stood on the edge of disaster. Their ships, the only hope of return to their homeland, were in peril. Without Achilles, their greatest warrior, they faced the prospect of complete defeat. The courage of Ajax and the wisdom of Odysseus held them together for a time, but the sight of burning ships struck fear into every heart. The tide of war had turned against them, and only fate would reveal whether salvation or ruin awaited them. The Greek army stood on the edge of destruction. Hector had broken through their defenses, and fire had touched the ships that carried their hope of ever returning home. With Agamemnon wounded and many of the bravest fighters struck down, the leaders gathered in despair. They knew there was only one man whose strength could turn the tide. Yet that man remained in his tent, far from battle, wounded not by spears, but by pride. At last, Agamemnon admitted the cost of his quarrel with Achilles. His insult had robbed the army of its greatest champion, and only reconciliation could restore hope. He prepared rich gifts as an offering of peace, treasures, and promises meant to soothe the heart of Achilles. Among these were gold, horses, women from captured cities, and even the return of Briseis, untouched. He pledged also that when Troy was taken, Achilles would share in the richest spoils, and that one day he could choose a daughter of Agamemnon as his bride. It was a lavish gesture, born not of generosity but of desperation, to deliver this message. 3 envoys were chosen. Odysseus, the master of words, would speak first with his gift of persuasion. Ajax, towering in strength and known for his straightforward honor, would add weight to the plea. Phoenix, the old companion and mentor of Achilles, would remind him of bonds older than war. Together, they carried the hopes of the entire Greek host as they made their way to the tent of the man they had once called their shield. When they arrived, they found Achilles seated beside Patroclus, his closest friend, listening to songs of old heroes. Though the war raged outside, his tent was filled with quiet. The envoys were welcomed with food and drink, for hospitality was sacred even in times of anger. Yet beneath the courtesy lay tension, for all knew the purpose of their visit. Odysseus spoke first, laying out the gifts and promises of Agamemnon. He described the danger facing the Greeks, the flames upon their ships, and the glory that awaited Achilles if he returned to battle. He appealed to reason, to honor, and to the fate that would forever remember Achilles if he saved his people. Then Phoenix spoke, his voice filled with emotion. He reminded Achilles of the years he had raised him, of the lessons of loyalty and mercy. His words were not those of a commander, but of a father figure, hoping to guide a son away from destructive anger. Ajax, last to speak, was direct and plain. He urged Achilles to set aside pride, for too many lives depended upon him. He spoke not of gifts or promises, but of the duty of a warrior to his comrades. Yet Achilles remained unmoved. His pride still burned fiercely, and the wound dealt by Agamemnon's insult had not healed. He declared that no treasure, no promise, no plea could sway him. He would not fight for Agamemnon, and if the Greeks wished to perish, it was their fate. He even spoke of a desire to return home, abandoning the war entirely. Thus, the embassy failed. The leaders left Achilles' tent in sorrow, for the man who could save them had chosen wrath over loyalty. In that moment, the course of the war darkened, and the story of the Iliad reached a turning point that would carry both Greeks and Trojans closer to tragedy. The Greek army was in despair. Flames licked the edges of their ships, and the roar of Trojan voices filled the air. The defenders of Troy, led by Hector, pressed harder than ever before. Within the camp, men looked to the horizon, praying for a savior, Yet Achilles remained withdrawn, his pride keeping him from battle. It was in this hour of darkness that Patroclus, the dearest companion of Achilles, came to him with a plea born of compassion and loyalty. Patroclus could not bear to watch his comrades fall one by one. He saw their shields broken, their spirits faltering, and the hope of the Greeks slipping away. He entered the tent of Achilles and begged him to set aside his anger, if only for the sake of those who fought and died on the field. Achilles listened but did not yield. His wrath against Agamemnon still burned, and he refused to fight under the command of the man who had dishonored him. Yet Patroclus did not relent. If Achilles himself would not return, then he asked for another gift. He begged to be allowed to take the armor of Achilles and wear it into battle. If the Trojans believed Achilles had returned, their courage might falter, and the Greeks could rally. It was a desperate request, but one born of devotion to his comrades, and a heart that could not stand idle while others suffered. Achilles was moved. Though he refused to go himself, he agreed to lend his armor and his chariot. He placed the shining bronze upon Patroclus and gave him words of warning. He told him to drive the Trojans from the ships, to save the army from destruction, but not to press too far toward the walls of Troy. Achilles knew the risks of overreaching, and he feared that Patroclus, carried away by victory, might fall to fate. With the armor upon him, Patroclus seemed transformed. To the Greeks, it was as if Achilles himself had returned. They gathered around him with renewed strength, their courage kindled by the sight of the shining armor. Patroclus led the charge, driving the Trojans back across the plain. The enemy fell before him, and even Hector was forced to give ground. For a time, the battle turned, and hope returned to the Greeks. Patroclus fought with valor unmatched. He struck down warriors and scattered the Trojan ranks, his heart filled with the joy of saving his companions. The gods themselves watched as he drove the enemy back from the burning ships. Yet in the heat of his triumph, he forgot the warning of Achilles. The taste of victory urged him onward, closer and closer to the walls of Troy. It was there that fate awaited him. Apollo, displeased by his boldness, struck him with a divine hand, dazing him and loosening his armor. In that moment of weakness, Hector found him. The Trojan prince, seizing the chance, drove his spear into Patroclus and struck him down. The man who had fought with such bravery fell upon the field, his soul leaving his body like a fading breath. The death of Patroclus was more than the loss of a warrior. It was the breaking of Achilles' heart, the spark that would awaken his wrath in a way no insult could. The Greeks mourned, the Trojans rejoiced, and destiny moved closer to its darkest hour. The battle for the ships had reached a fevered pitch, and at its center stood Patroclus, shining in the borrowed armor of Achilles. His courage burned like fire, and the Greeks rallied at his side, believing their greatest champion had returned. The Trojans, pressed hard by his charge, fell back in confusion, and for a time it seemed that disaster had been turned away. Yet, in the turning of fate, triumph often hides the shadow of ruin. Patroclus, carried away by the strength of his success, ignored the warning of Achilles. Instead of stopping once the ships were saved, he drove the Trojans further, pushing them toward the very gates of Troy. His spear flashed, and warriors fell before him. He struck Sarpedon, son of Zeus, bringing down a prince beloved by the king of the gods himself. With each victory, Patroclus grew bolder, but his boldness led him beyond the bounds set by destiny. It was then that Apollo, guardian of Troy, descended into the struggle. Angered by Patroclus' defiance and his advance, Against the city, the god struck him from behind. The blow dazed him, filling his body with weakness. His vision dimmed, and the strength that had carried him faltered. Apollo tore away his armor piece by piece, leaving him vulnerable on the field. The brilliance that had made him appear as Achilles was stripped away, and Patroclus stood exposed as only a mortal man in that moment. Fate delivered him into the hands of Hector. The Trojan prince, seeing his chance, charged forward with spear ready. Though Patroclus tried to resist, his limbs no longer answered with their former power. Hector cast his spear and struck true, piercing his body and sending him crashing to the earth. The dust rose around him as his spirit wavered. With his final breath, Patroclus foretold that Hector too would meet his end at the hands of Achilles. Yet his prophecy faded as death claimed him. The fall of Patroclus sent shock through the battlefield. The Greeks cried out in anguish, for the man who had fought so bravely was lost. Hector stood over him in triumph, yet his victory was more than the death of an enemy. It was the turning of the tide, a moment that would awaken a wrath greater than any yet seen in the war. Hector did not let the moment pass without seizing its prize. He stripped the armor of Achilles from the fallen body, claiming it as a trophy of conquest. To the Trojans, it was a symbol of victory, proof that the man they feared most could be brought low. Yet, in truth, the armor belonged to Achilles, and its theft would become the chain that bound Hector to his own fate. Patroclus lay lifeless on the field, the dust of Troy clinging to his form. His death was more than the loss of a warrior. It was a wound to Achilles' soul, a blow that would turn grief into fury and unleash a storm upon the Trojans unlike any they had ever known. The war, once balanced by shifting tides, now rushed toward vengeance and destruction. The death of Patroclus shattered the heart of Achilles. When the news reached him, grief poured from him like a flood. He cast dust upon his head, tore at his hair, and cried out with a voice so terrible that even the waves of the sea seemed to echo his sorrow. His mourning was deep, for Patroclus was more than a companion. He was the one who shared Achilles' heart, his anchor in the storm of pride and anger. With Patroclus gone, Achilles' sorrow burned into something greater, a rage so fierce that it shook even the gods. Yet he could not return to battle at once, for Hector had stripped the armor from Patroclus's body, leaving Achilles without protection. To answer his grief, his mother Thetis, a goddess of the sea, rose from the depths to comfort him. She heard his cries and promised him that he would not be left unarmed. She carried his plea to Hephaestus, the divine smith of Olympus, whose forge blazed with unearthly fire. There, among anvils and hammers, the god crafted armor such as no mortal had ever seen. The shield alone was a wonder, vast and shining with images of the world itself. Upon it were scenes of cities at peace and cities at war, fields of harvest, dances of youth, and constellations that circled the night sky. The breastplate gleamed like fire, the helmet blazed with light, and the greaves shone with polished strength. This armor was not only a gift of protection, but a vision of the mortal world, a reminder of all that men strive for, even as they fall to fate. When Thetis placed the armor before her son, Achilles' spirit surged anew. His grief did not vanish, but it was now joined with a terrible resolve. He would avenge Patroclus. He would bring down Hector, no matter what destiny awaited him afterward. For Achilles knew that his own death was foretold to follow close upon Hector's, yet he accepted it. In the face of loss, he chose vengeance over life. Before returning to battle, Achilles met once more with Agamemnon, The quarrel that had torn them apart seemed small beside the ruin that had come from it. Agamemnon admitted his fault and returned Briseis to Achilles, untouched. Words of reconciliation passed between them, but their truce was not born of friendship. It was necessity, for both knew that only Achilles could save the Greeks from destruction. The past insult lingered, yet the greater weight of fate pressed them forward together. With the new armor upon him, Achilles stepped forth once more. His appearance filled both friend and foe with awe. The Trojans trembled at the sight, for they knew that Hector's triumph over Patroclus had awakened a storm. They could not escape. The Greeks lifted their voices in renewed courage, for their greatest warrior had returned at last. Achilles' wrath, once fixed on Agamemnon, now turned wholly toward Hector. It was no longer a quarrel among allies, but a single consuming desire. The fall of Patroclus demanded vengeance, and nothing would quench Achilles' fury until Hector lay slain. The field of Troy braced itself, for the hour of reckoning had come. When Achilles returned to the battlefield, it was as though a storm had descended upon the plain. His new armor blazed with light, and his very presence struck fear into the hearts of the Trojans. After long days of absence, he moved with fury and strength, and the Greeks surged behind him with renewed hope. Yet for Achilles, there was no thought of strategy or mercy. His mind was fixed only on vengeance for Patroclus, and his wrath poured out like fire. He struck down warrior after warrior, cutting a path through the Trojan ranks. None could stand before him. Spears shattered, shields splintered, and men fell in heaps wherever he passed. The Trojans, who had once pressed forward with confidence, now fled in terror, pursued by a man who seemed more like a god of war than a mortal. Achilles did not pause to take captives or claim spoils. His anger consumed him, and his only desire was slaughter. So many lives fell beneath his spear that even the gods looked down in wonder and unease. The river Scamander, swollen with the bodies of the slain, rose up in anger. Its waters had become choked with blood, and the god who dwelt within it could no longer bear the destruction. From the depths of the river, Scamander rose against Achilles, sending waves surging to sweep him away. The waters crashed over the plain, carrying corpses in their flood. Achilles struggled as the river rose higher, threatening to drag him under. For a moment, the great warrior who had terrified armies was nearly overcome by the force of nature itself. But even then, his resolve did not break. The gods of Olympus watched, and Hera and Hephaestus came to his aid. With fire and flame, Hephaestus dried the flood, forcing the river back into its bed and saving Achilles from drowning in its wrath. The clash of gods did not end there. The war of men became a war of the heavens as the divine powers chose their sides and entered the fray. Hera, Athena, and Poseidon moved in defense of the Greeks, while Apollo, Ares, and Aphrodite lent their strength. To the Trojans, Olympus itself seemed divided, and the plain before Troy shook beneath their quarrels. The gods struck at one another with might that shattered mountains and shook the air. Athena felled Ares with her spear, sending the god of war sprawling upon the ground. Hera struck at Artemis, mocking her youth. Poseidon and Apollo glared at one another, though the old bond between them softened their blows. Zeus, high above, watched with both amusement and restraint, knowing that the fates of mortals still guided the outcome. Through all this, Achilles raged on, relentless and unstoppable. His wrath was no longer bound by human measure. To the Trojans, he was destruction incarnate, a single man who fought with the fury of many. Though rivers rose and gods clashed, nothing could turn him aside from his path. His vengeance, kindled by grief and sharpened by rage, drove him onward to the moment all had begun to fear. His final confrontation with Hector, the eyes of the world turned to the walls of Troy. For there at last the destined moment had arrived. Achilles, blazing in his divine armor, stood before the gates, calling for Hector. The Trojans, terrified by his presence, retreated inside the city, but Hector remained, torn between fear and duty. He knew that his death awaited him if he fought. Yet to retreat would bring shame upon his name and upon his family. As Achilles advanced, Hector's courage faltered. He turned and fled, his heart pounding with the knowledge that he faced a force greater than any man. Around the walls of Troy they ran, not once, but 3 times, Achilles in pursuit, relentless as a shadow. The people of Troy watched from the battlements, their cries rising into the air as they saw their champion fleeing for his life. Achilles did not slow, for his wrath gave him speed beyond mortal measure. At last, the gods intervened. Athena, favoring Achilles, appeared to Hector. In the form of his brother, she urged him to stand and fight, promising aid at his side. Believing he would not face Achilles alone, Hector turned and raised his spear. Only when the battle began did he realize the cruel deception. His brother was not there, and Athena had vanished. He stood alone, with no escape left to him, facing the most fearsome warrior of the age. Summoning his courage, Hector cast his spear at Achilles, but it struck the shield and rebounded, leaving him defenseless. He looked for another weapon, hoping for help from Phaebus, but none came. In that moment, the truth fell upon him. The gods had abandoned him, and his fate was sealed. Achilles closed the distance, his spear aimed with deadly precision. He knew where the armor was weakest, and with a thrust he struck Hector through the neck. The Trojan prince fell to the ground, his life slipping away even as he gasped his final words. With dignity, Hector asked that his body be returned to his family for proper burial, that his honor might be preserved in death. But Achilles, consumed by fury, refused. His grief for Patroclus had hardened his heart, and mercy was lost to him. With cold words, he denied Hector's plea, vowing instead to let dogs and birds consume his flesh. When Hector breathed his last, Achilles fastened the body to his chariot by the ankles. Before the eyes of Troy, he dragged Hector's lifeless form across the plain. Dust rose around the body, and the people within the city wailed in despair. For their defender, their greatest hope, had been struck down and dishonored. Priam, the aged king, tore at his robes in grief, while Andromache, wife of Hector, collapsed at the sight of her husband's fate. Thus ended the duel that had been foretold, the meeting of the greatest warrior of Greece and the noblest son of Troy. With Hector's death, the spirit of Troy was broken, and the war moved toward its tragic close. Yet even in victory, Achilles stood diminished, for his triumph was stained with cruelty, and his vengeance left no space for peace. Within the high walls of Troy, silence fell heavy after the death of Hector. Where once there had been shouts of courage and the clamor of warriors, there was now only the sound of weeping. The people crowded upon the battlements, their voices rising in cries of sorrow as they watched Achilles drag the lifeless body of their champion across the dust. No grief could be greater, for Hector had been the heart of Troy, the shield of the city, and the hope of its people. In the palace, Priam, the aged king, sank to the ground in anguish. His hair, already white with years, seemed to grow heavier with grief. He called out the name of his son, the noblest of his many children, now lost. Hecuba, the queen, lifted her hands to the heavens in despair. She cursed the gods who had abandoned her child, asking why such cruelty had been laid upon Troy. The lament of parents for a fallen son is a sorrow beyond measure, and in that moment the palace was filled with cries that shook even the walls. Andromache, wife of Hector, had not yet heard the full tale when her heart gave way to dread. She rushed to the walls, and there she saw what she had feared. The body of her husband lay dragged behind the chariot of Achilles, defiled in death. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she fell fainting into the arms of her attendants. When she regained her strength, her voice rose in lament, not only for her husband but for the fate of her son, little Astyanax. She foresaw the cruelty of the future, where her child, once heir to Troy's greatest warrior, would grow up fatherless, his destiny overshadowed by loss. She feared that when Troy fell, the boy would be cast from the walls or carried into slavery, and her sorrow deepened beyond words. The city as a whole joined in mourning. Women tore at their hair and garments, filling the streets with wailing. Men who had once fought bravely stood in silence, their hearts broken, for without Hector they felt the shadow of doom closing over them. The people knew that with his death their last great defense had fallen. No other prince could rally the Trojans as Hector had done, and no other leader could match his honor or his devotion. The sorrow of Troy stood in stark contrast to the mood of the Greek camp. There, the warriors rejoiced at the return of Achilles and the death of their greatest foe. Songs of victory and shouts of triumph rose through the night, while the Trojans huddled in darkness, consumed by despair. One city celebrated, while the other drowned in grief. In their mourning, the Trojans lifted their voices to the gods, yet the heavens were silent. Fate had already chosen its path, and the fall of Troy drew nearer. Still, in their grief, the people clung to love for Hector, honoring him as the defender who had given everything for his city. Their tears washed the walls, and their sorrow became the final hymn of Troy's greatness. Night fell upon the plain of Troy, and in the Greek camp the body of Hector still lay in the possession of Achilles. The Trojans mourned within their walls, yet their sorrow found no rest while their champion remained dishonored. It was then that Priam, king of Troy and father of Hector, resolved upon a daring act. Guided by courage born of love, he left the safety of the city and journeyed into the enemy camp to face the slayer of his son, with the aid of Hermes, who walked beside him unseen. Priam entered the tent of Achilles. There he found the warrior, still restless with grief and anger, his heart heavy with the memory of Patroclus. The old king fell at his feet, taking the hands that had killed so many of his sons. He kissed them, wetting them with tears, and spoke words that pierced the heart more deeply than any spear. Priam did not speak as a king, but as a father. He asked for the return of Hector's body, not for victory, not for peace, but for the right to mourn his son with honor. He reminded Achilles of his own father, Peleus, an old man who still lived far away in Greece, longing for the son he might never see again. Priam's voice trembled as he begged Achilles to think of his father and to have pity. For a moment, Achilles sat in silence, torn between fury and compassion. The memory of his father, aged and frail, stirred within him, and grief for Patroclus weighed upon his soul. In Priam's plea he saw not only the sorrow of an enemy, but the universal sorrow of a parent who has lost a child. Slowly, his heart softened, and tears filled his eyes. Achilles raised Priam from the ground, and, for the first time since death, he shared his grief with another. Achilles agreed to return the body of Hector. He ordered it to be washed and anointed with oils, treating it with the dignity once denied. The armor was set aside, and the body was placed upon a bier, ready to be borne back to Troy. For a brief moment, the hatred of war lifted, and two men, once enemies, shared a bond of sorrow and recognition. Priam departed the camp with his sons. Body, and within the walls of Troy the people wept anew. The funeral rites of Hector were carried out with solemn care. His family and his people gathered to honor him, to sing his praises, and to commit his spirit to the memory of generations. Thus the Iliad, though filled with battles and wrath, closed not with conquest or ruin, but with the image of mourning and respect. The poem does not tell of the fall of Troy. That story lies beyond its bounds. Instead, it ends with the funeral of Hector, the man who had borne the hopes of his city. In this ending lies the true theme, the cost of wrath, the limits of honor, and the inevitability of mortality. As the story closes, it leaves us with reflection. Glory fades, wrath burns itself away, but love and grief remain eternal. The Iliad teaches that even in the heart of war, humanity endures, and in compassion, even enemies may find common ground.